Hello, welcome to the New Stack Makers, a podcast where we talk about at-scale application development, deployment, and management. This episode of the New Stack Makers is brought to you by Twistlock, the complete cloud-native security platform protecting containers, serverless, and Kubernetes applications against threats. Twistlock is the only cloud-native security platform to provide real-time threat intelligence and management through the application development lifecycle across every cloud-native environment. Hey, it's Alex Williams of the New Stack here at KubeCon, and we have a discussion here with some people who all have participation in some form in open source communities, either leading them or part of them or both. So I thought maybe, Jason, you could start and we can go around the table and just introduce ourselves.
My name is Jason Dobies. I'm a technical marketing manager at Red Hat. Been there for about 12 and a half years now. And like you said, some involvement with open source communities, and Red Hat is pretty involved in that area.
Just a little tiny bit.
So my name is Ed Warnicke. I'm a distinguished consulting engineer at Cisco Systems, and I've been involved in pretty much all of the open source networking projects of the Linux Foundation. I was a founding member of the TSC at Open Daylight, ONAP. I'm currently the TSC chair at FDIO, and I guess the current thing that's got most of my attention is network service mesh.
And I am Heather Kirksey. I work at the Linux Foundation, primarily with our networking oriented projects, and to make sure that people knows that's with a packet forwarding, not people interacting, although people interacting is a lot of what I do. So I head up our community and ecosystem programs there.
Yeah, my name is Alex Ellis. I'm a senior staff engineer at VMware, working in the open source program office. And my chief role there is to lead and maintain OpenVAS, which is a serverless project that I created as an own-time project about 2 years ago. It's now really big in the community, and it's still independent from a corporation.
So people interacting, that's a great first topic. Well, Heather, what do you mean by people interacting?
One of my jokes, actually, is that the problem with open source is it's made of people. But really, when it comes down to working in open source communities, it's oftentimes the, getting consensus, helping people work across, different geopolitical, cultural expectations, across corporate boundaries, beginning to think of themselves as on the same team, helping folks learn how to build consensus for their features. You just can't throw something in. So, one of the things about open source is that there's a lot more, I think, social and cultural component to it than a lot of times just development sort of within your own silos within your company, because you need to lead by sort of influence and exciting people rather than being able to tell your developers what to do.
So how do you get them excited? I mean, Alex, how do you get people excited about these open source projects?
Beer.
Fear is a good start.
So one of the things I think is really key to open source success is just understanding how people work, and they want to be appreciated. They want to feel like they're part of something bigger. But also there's some principles there, like reciprocity, where if you give someone something, they feel like they should give you something back. Like at Christmas, you buy your wife something for $200, she'll get you something for $200 or $250. And in open source, it's kind of the same. And so sometimes you're actually kind of seeding stuff and you won't see returns. But some of the times you will, and they'll be like tenfold. So my sort of secret is to invest in people and just always be trying to help them out.
Ed, how are you investing?
So it turns out that in most of the open source communities I've been involved with, you've got a bunch of people who are excited about an idea. And there are just very small impediments that get in their way. And so I will typically practice what I refer to as social arbitrage, because I will find something that is blocking someone that is easy for someone else, and you match them. That unlocks the person who's got a small blockage in the face of their enthusiasm, lets them run forward. It lets the person who helped them feel like they've actually done something good and helpful for the community. And it generally makes life easier for everyone, because the truth of the matter is, almost everything is easy for someone. Just not necessarily the guy who's facing down the problem at this particular moment.
Right, and eventually that'll be simpler for them if they learn it, and then they can pass that on.
Oh, they absolutely do. You sort of look around and you realize that just a tiny bit of effort that you or someone else has put in has sort of blossomed into sort of general knowledge of what's going on in the world. Although that can sometimes lead in interesting directions. I have an endless array of things where if I realized everyone was going to copy that section of code for years, I probably would have put a little more care into it.
But Jason, people. There's a little bit of kumbaya, right? But like, what about the company? What about the organization? What's the value there? And like, why do you have to put such a focus on people? The kind of companies often who are new to this stuff don't often get that, do they?
I think I'll kind of tangentially answer this. So the project I worked on before this, I was an engineer on OpenStack, and one of the reasons I went to it is because I was kind of fascinated by the idea that all of these different companies would be contributing to a product, and I didn't see how anything got done. I expected I had my responsibilities, and something that you mentioned made me think of this too. It's not as easy as me going to my manager and saying, hey, go make Bob do this by Friday because I need it for my stuff on Monday. When there's no central manager, you don't have that, and suddenly you actually have to rely on yourself to convince them, or through whatever reason. If it's, I can't say the word
reciprocity.
Thank you. What he said. The idea of, I'm friendly, I'm helpful, people want to help me back. And then I do think, though, back to your question, your company culture tends to push that from the start. So the companies involved in OpenStack, in that particular case, understood from the get-go, we're not getting in this just for our own gain. We're getting in this to be part of something bigger. We're getting in this because we're nerdy and we're into this idea, and it's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be a lot of value, but we understand going in what to expect out of that, and that things are going to be a little bit trickier to work with, and that's okay. And if that's where your value set lies, then you approach it from that perspective to start with, and everything goes a little bit smoother.
So Heather, then what does that mean then, for example, about for organizations and how markets grow? I mean, you work with the Linux Foundation. This is a large part of what you guys what you're trying to do. How do you smoothen the transition for these organizations?
So there are a lot of things, and kind of just starting, first of all, with just governance, right? So ensuring that you have a governance structure so that companies and people feel as though they will be equal players at the table. So, kind of getting your governance right and documented. And that's not the fun, cool stuff, but it's sort of, I think, a foundational requirement for the kind of magic that happens on top of that. And then it's a lot of just talking to the community and looking to create opportunities for collaboration, whether that is, helping ensuring that non-native speakers feel as though they have an opportunity to speak up. So sometimes that means, ensuring that we've got IRC going as well, because sometimes doing things in writing is more easy than verbally on calls. Looking, to Ed's point, looking for barriers, removing them, and also creating sort of, social engagement situations, receptions. That's the reason there are fun events at most of these conferences, is because once you get to know someone as a person, it's a lot harder to send that mean or snarky email, and it's a lot easier to say, oh, I've met this person, let me reach out and start by asking them questions, or feeling safe to express a dissenting opinion, and kind of having, and then just reinforcing that this is who we are, right? Like, we are a respectful community.
Right.
We can be contentious, but we don't take things personally, and we never devolve into personal attacks or things like that, and just making sure that you model that yourself, and encouraging the community leaders to model that.
But that can't happen. So what do you do when it does? I mean, that's where the role of the maintainers really comes in, and they have to be, to some extent, pretty prepared for that, don't they?
Yeah, and it's also sometimes where staff will come in, if I've definitely been brought into situations where there's a lot of headbutting, and, I'll be asked to, kind of help mediate conversations and point out, you're both trying to solve a problem, you just have very different reasons. Here, let's sit down and discuss this over a beer. For example, get out of the kind of public situation, sit down over a beer or, a coffee or whatever, and have that conversation and sort of get back to, like, what are you trying to achieve, and get some agreement on a problem that you're trying to solve.
Mm-hmm. So Ed, with thinking about the large role that open source has, how do you compare it now to like 5 years ago? We just had a pretty major acquisition happen, right? Where we saw the acquisition of Red Hat, for example, by IBM, and that doesn't change the open source process at all, but it does signal some changes in the world at large, doesn't it? What does it to you signal?
Well, I mean, so I've basically been involved in open source for over 20 years now.
Yeah.
And so it just feels like a continuation of the overall business adoption picture that's just been progressing through time, right? So I can still remember back in the early days in the late 90s where clearly no serious party would ever use this stuff in production because reasons. And then everyone did. And then, no one will ever make any money at this.
And then
everyone did. And then, but this is, for really industrial carrier grade things, you need, but actually, no, this works there too. And so it's sort of the growing march of everyone realizing that effectively, the world is changing, and we actually, in some sense, have done ourselves a disservice by calling open source, because it focuses on things like licenses. It focuses on those aspects of the system. The truth is, open source is the most successful collaboration model on Earth. And collaboration, generally speaking, is good business. And what you've got is a slow and increasing realization, just washing through the entire economy over the course of decades, that this is the case. And that there's a tremendous amount of value that can be added that isn't the flipping software. Right? There's tons of money to be made. You don't have to clutch things. So one of the conversations I have repeatedly with executives is, executives have been trained for decades to think about clutching intellectual property because they see it as valuable, and it is valuable. But there's often more value in letting go than there is in holding on.
I do Buddhist meditation to help me do my job.
Do you?
Actually, yeah, I mean, I was saying that facetiously, but I do.
How does it help?
Kind of to that, not taking things personally and being able to let go and have sort of a more non-clutching mentality about life in general.
How do you do that inside inside OpenFast then? I mean, how do you think about that? Do you think about open source as something that's antiquated, or do you think of it as a terminology that still fits?
So I don't really have a very strong opinion on the term open source, but I can see what Ed is saying. I think it's got some really great points about giving up control. In fact, this is something that I was talking about internally at VMware recently is, what's the point of giving a project to a foundation? And, Heather touched on this a little bit about having that governance and other companies being able to trust it. And I think for OpenFAS, that not being tied into a vendor, like VMware never acquired it, is actually a really positive thing because people see it as like a neutral ground. But when we have stuff internally, and a good project example to be Turn by Nisha Kumar within the Open Source Program Office, that's a project that seeks to do compliance on containers, figure out what's inside it, help you make sense of it. That was actually donated to a new group within the Linux Foundation, right? The
OpenChain, maybe?
Believe.
Okay, yeah.
ARC.
Okay.
And basically it's about automated container tooling.
Oh, okay.
And so one of the reasons why they gave that there is because they didn't want people to see it as a VMware project, but as something that other people could contribute to and make use of. Yeah. And so it's just that clutching mentality to IP. Businesses will think, we need to hold the IP. What if we lose it?
Right.
What about the patents?
Right.
Right. You can get paid various companies certain amounts of money for creating a software patent. And as part of your just general training, even open source engineers go through that. And so then you have this conflict of interest, and you can see it visibly, like the dichotomy in the company. Like, we want to clutch onto IP to get patents because that's what you do, but also we want to do open source, so they can be at odds at sometimes.
So Jason, when you're thinking about open source and how you think about how customers use open source, what is it that you see from customers in changing how they view open source and open source strategy? You said you've been involved in open source projects for 12 years or so. Is there a marked change you're starting to see in the past year, 2 years?
I would have put the time frame a lot longer than that. I think Ed's got a point that there was a time, and I've got just about as much experience as him, so I saw a lot of this growth of, oh my God, no, don't do this. This is scary. I actually kind of bought into that a little bit. So in college, my ethics class, I distinctly remember discussing open source, and I was like, no, this has no place. Plus, I was like, oh, I'm going to go out and have this billion-dollar idea, and I'm going to keep it all myself. And then fast forward a couple of years, I start working at Red Hat, and I go back, and my ethics teacher remembered from literally 8-9 years before that I was anti-open source, and not only threw it in my face, to this day, every single semester he teaches it, he mentions me by name. And students come up to me and they're like, Dr. Fleischman mentioned you the other day. This is the open source thing. He's like, yeah. So to your point, that was a while ago. I think the mentality, it's not a hard sell anymore to get customers on board with it. There's not this scary feeling of, oh my God, what is this? What's going on? Is there something bad happening? I think more than anything, they're starting to realize they need to not take it for granted. So 2 to 3 years ago, the Open SSL issue. Okay, so I'm seeing that. That's what I'm thinking of, where everyone realized, like, oh, there's 2 guys maintaining this, and the vast majority of the internet runs on it. Maybe we need to give back to open source. Maybe we should actually like do something instead of just using this. And I think as bad of an example as that is, whereas much as that's a horror story, I think it kind of awoke a lot of eyes to, hey, we really do rely on this, and it doesn't just magically appear. And I think that that helped really cement the change in mentality from this is not just a scary thing to this is also not free in the sense that it's going to magically appear, and it's something that we do need to contribute to and foster and kind of help to continue to grow, because we've all suddenly started to rely on it, and we need the people to stay involved with it.
So, I mean, to your experiences 9 years ago, you were saying no, open source, forget it. Ed, now, you know, with projects that you see out there and people joining these projects, when they're thinking about introducing their own organization to open source approaches, do you provide them any advice now? Is there any kind of...
Oh, a lot.
Yeah.
And Ed's not shy about giving advice. I
No, not at all.
Go on the record as saying.
So, I mean, one of the things that was very interesting with the launch of the Open Daylight project, which was sort of the first big open networking project where a lot of the networking players were trying to do open source, is I would continually get a bunch of people from various collaborators who sometimes happen to also be competitors wandering up and saying, I'm stuck in legal. Or I'm stuck with this, or I'm stuck with that. Yeah. And because I've been doing open source for so long and been doing it in Cisco for so long, one of the things I could offer them as advice was, okay, it's been my experience and the experience of people that I've advised that if you simply say it with the following words, that your attorneys relax. You can like literally watch the tension drain from their body. And there's a lot to be said for that, because you have a whole bunch of people who are used to thinking about particular kinds of issues that they're responsible for. And you just have to figure out how you're going to put them at ease. And it turns out that there are often some categorical patterns that do that. And so there's a lot of things you can do that will ease the process within a particular company. There are a lot of examples you can point to. People, when they're trying to assess a situation, will often look for exemplars that they can crib off of, because very few people have the time to think through a problem entirely themselves. So if you can point to a large company that is doing something in open source successfully and profitably, then you've just got an existence proof with whoever you're dealing with that you're trying to convince within your organization.
So Heather, how do you teach people best practices? I mean, because what you want a healthy you want to have a healthy governance.
Right.
You want to have a healthy community that that is representative of of society, for example. But so what are the best approaches that you really try to instill when you're talking to people?
Yeah. So I mean, it kind of varies if you're talking about kind of talking at corporate executive level.
Let's talk about a corporate executive level.
So I mean, I think if there's someone who hasn't been participating in open source, if you've gotten them through maybe the legal hurdles and the, is this going to be good for business hurdles, and they're like, okay, the next thing will usually be, how do I get involved, or how do I contribute, or how should I, start sending, the folks in. For one thing, there's a lot of free online training that the Linux Foundation actually has on a lot of these topics that is free that you can go and do. And then the other thing that I always tell people is if you're interested in a project and you're not quite sure which part of it you want to get involved in, 2 places to start. Or actually maybe 3, and those are the supporting aspects to any project that usually need folks. You'll get a halo of good citizenship around you, and you'll also learn. One is documentation. So use the documentation to try to use the software. You will, through your own experience, figure out where the documentation is unclear or inadequate. And if you come and start bringing documentation bugs and submitting documentation patches, you'll make people happy because we always need more documentation. Same thing for testing. And same thing for things like release engineering and release management activities and integration sort of activities. And you'll get exposed to most of the project. People will like you, and then you can start figuring out where maybe there are features and stuff like that you want to
It's
address.
stronger than that, right? So somebody who has a history of when you explain something to them, submitting a documentation patch, when they hit you on IRC at 3 o'clock in the morning, you will spend an hour explaining something to them because the return on investment is just tremendous. Right? Nothing is going to get people helping you faster than that.
I wanted to add something if I can. I think we've got to go a bit further than that. And I was looking at the New Stack's research on open source program offices.
Yep.
And this is only something that I've really seen as I joined VMware. I didn't really notice it when I was just doing open source by myself, in a big company where there wasn't a lot of open source culture. And, it makes such a big impact to the points that Heather and Ed and Justin are making. You're there as an internal advocate, but you're also there to provide mentorship, leadership, and guidance. And that's something that I've really noticed. And we've got some great people there. And it's not just one company. 50% of large companies, your research says, have these program offices. And we probably are in them, right? I can't stress how important they are. And how hard it is for developers that have always been working internally to actually contribute. Like, I've helped teams and they just come and they just have no clue. Like, they think that, like Justin said, you can just ping your boss and they'll put pressure, but you can't use your back channels anymore, even if it originated from your company.
So to the back channels, one of the things that people tend to get caught up on is having conversations in public. So if you're very used to having an office and being able to wander over to a cubicle and have a conversation, it's a big adjustment to be like, no, take that to the chat room, take that to the mailing list, because people need to see it, they need to be archived. And you're not necessarily intentionally holding information, but to get that community, you actually have to work and understand, wait, this is something that we should be saying publicly, so that way people can contribute and they can feel welcome to it. And it's a transition, and if you don't get initially told that, you won't think of it on your own.
Yeah, we have, within my team, now that I'm at VMware, I have a team there, full-time contributors, and then the open source contributors as well, who probably are doing more proportionately of the work right now. And I have to keep going back and saying, can you just put that in the GitHub issue? Can you just talk to that person? Can you stop DMing me and put it in the channel?
Yeah.
And it's hard, even when you think you're doing it well, to influence people and lead them. And you've just got to be really disciplined, I think.
Yeah. Well, and I think depending on your corporate culture or maybe even your national culture, sometimes there's also an intimidation factor about sort of, maybe calling out something that people will, you're afraid that you'll look stupid. So that's often, I actually oversee all of our onboarding calls with new members into to LF networking. And one of the things that I'm always sure to say on the calls is, look, you need to do this in public because that's how these things focus. It will be considered a lack of transparency if you don't. And don't be intimidated, because we have kind, welcoming communities who are happy to answer your questions and happy to help you and happy to point you to people or code or documentation. Read the manual before you show up. Show that you've invested. Don't make your lack of knowledge other people's problems. But if you still have questions, people love to be helpful. Really, I have found, and they also know that they're going to make you productive and make their lives easier, so they'll invest in that. So that's another thing that I tell people in our onboarding for membership is, do not be afraid to go on the mailing lists and bring up issues, ask questions, go put things in the JIRA, all that sort of stuff.
Well, terrific. Well, this has been a lot of fun having this conversation with you all. I appreciate it. And I really appreciate the perspectives. I think it's such an education. You spend so much time, I think, explaining and helping people understand topics. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This episode of the New Stack Makers is brought to you by Twistlock, the complete cloud-native security platform protecting containers, serverless, and Kubernetes applications against threats. Twistlock is the only cloud-native security platform to provide real-time threat intelligence and management through the application development lifecycle across every cloud-native environment. Listen to more episodes of the New Stack Makers at thenewstack.io/podcast. Please rate and review us on iTunes, like us on YouTube, and follow us on SoundCloud. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.